What's going on, guys? Today we're going to learn about the power of the blend if feature in Photoshop and the easiest ways to incorporate this amazing tool into your own work. So let's get into it. What's happening, guys? My name is Brendan from BeWellCreative.com, home to editing tutorials, camera gear reviews, tricks, and tips, all aimed to help you improve your photo editing and photography. Now, if you are new to this channel and you love Photoshop and photography, then definitely consider hitting that subscribe button to stay up to date with more videos just like this one. And also remember to hit that bell button to get a notification every time a new video is uploaded. Secondly, if you're wanting to see a little bit more of my work, make sure to find me on Instagram at Burnwills. And with that, let's get started on this tutorial. So just as the title says, we're going to be talking all about blend if today in Photoshop. So the blend if tool in Photoshop is a really amazing tool that it seems like not a lot of people truly understand the uses of it, but once you do understand the use of it, it's a pretty amazing tool that you can incorporate in a lot of different photos. So the blend if tool is a tool that sits within our layer style dialog box, and to access that panel, all we have to do is, of course, make sure our layer is not locked, and we can just double click on that layer and our layer style dialog box comes up, and it's right here under blending options, and right down at the bottom here you'll notice it says blend if, and then our two separate sliders here. So this is the blend if option in Photoshop. We just have two separate sliders, this layer, underlying layer, and we have a couple options from gray, red, green, and blue. So that's what today's tutorial is all about, is these two little sliders and the powerful things that they can do to your images. So the first thing that you will notice here is, looking at these two sliders, is they are exactly the same, and they are just two gradients transitioning from black to white. So now what I'm going to do is just create a new layer and add a gradient that matches this same gradient that we see in our blend if panel. So I'm just going to create a new layer, grab my gradient tool, select the black to white gradient, and I'm just going to click on one side of my image, drag to the other to add that gradient in. So now I have a gradient that matches just about the blend if sliders. So now let's experiment with blend if on this gradient. So I'm going to double click on my gradient layer, and now let's see what happens when I start to work with these sliders. So the blend if sliders have these two little points on either side, and you can drag them wherever you'd like within the gradient of the blend if. But as you notice, things start to change seemingly randomly as I change where these points sit within the gradients of either this layer gradient or the underlying layer gradient. So what exactly is going on here? Basically, what these little points represent is the base of what is able to be shown on a specific layer. So in this case, since we have our points at either end, that means that everything from black all the way to white is going to be able to be seen in our image. So in this really simple scenario here, we have a very simple gradient, and because we have all of those colors within the gradient selected between our 2 points, that means that our entire gradient is active. Just going to move this box up out of the way a little so we can see better. Now that we know that these 2 points represent what is allowed to be shown in our image, if I start to drag up this bottom point of this layer slider, so that means it's going to be affecting the current layer, which is our gradient. If I begin to bring up that bottom slider, you'll notice that the edge starts to shift in as I go closer to white. So basically what's happening is, like I said, this point is a hard stop, as we see with this line, is a hard stop of what colors are able to be shown within our luminance range. So since we've changed our base so our darkest point can only be within this middle gray here, that means that all of these colors going from this middle gray down to black are now going to be completely invisible on our image. So that's what we are seeing right here. Now if I continue to bring up that slider, it just continues to make less and less visible because it is now behind our point. It is not within the blend if range that we have selected. So I'm going to bring this slider all the way back to its original position, and now we'll do the opposite. So just like with our blacks here, if I bring up my white slider and I start to slide this down our luminance range, you'll notice that the exact same thing is happening, but now it's starting to make the whites more transparent as we transition our 2 points closer to black. So now only really the darker colors are able to be seen within our layer. Now going down to our underlying layer, a very similar thing happens, except now what happens is, rather than this gradient being completely visible and it's blacks or it's whites, now it's the underlying layer that's going to dictate where our gradient is visible. At my underlying layer slider here, if I start to drag up this bottom slider here, you'll notice that now I'm starting to see some of the dark areas in my underlying image, which is the fitness running image here. So just like before when our darks were becoming transparent, this is a similar thing that is happening on our underlying layer. So now since we have changed our blend if option so our underlying layer will not be affected in these dark areas anymore, that means that our gradient will not be shown in any of these shadowed areas within our image. So as I continue to drag up here, now more grays are coming into the image and so on and so forth. So like I said, as we start to drag into more of the whites, there are more things that are not allowed to be affected by our gradient anymore. By moving this underlying layer blend if slider, we're basically telling Photoshop that we don't want this gradient to be affecting any luminance range outside of this light gray to white. Anything darker than this light gray to white, we do not want our gradient to be affecting. So that's what this underlying layer slider is basically telling us. Now similarly, going over to the other side of our underlying layer slider and bringing that down, now the highlights are beginning to show through our gradient, and that's because we're telling Photoshop that we don't want our gradient to be shown on anywhere from this point to the end here. So as I drag this up even further, we're now telling Photoshop that from this very light gray to white, I don't want my gradient to be affecting anything. So that is why we're starting to see those really bright areas show through on our gradient. Now this is all great and stuff, but what is the point of being able to get rid of some of the blacks or some of the whites in our gradient or luminance of a layer, or maybe even show through some of our bottom layer? So what is the point of all that, especially if it's just a harsh and really unattractive looking edge as you see here? So a trick that we can use to make our blend if slider adjustments really blend in is to add a feather onto the luminance ranges edges. So currently, as I move a slider, you notice it has a very, very harsh edge here. But let's say I want to add a feather here, so I want it to slowly feather from black into the grays. So now what I can do is by holding Alt or Option and clicking on that point, it's going to split apart into two, and as you notice, as I drag this over, it is still making this other area transparent, but now rather than a harsh edge, it's a nice feather into the middle gray here. So this is a really key thing to know when using blend if, because then you can make your colors or your adjustments blend really softly and subtly into your photo by adding this feather onto the blend if luminance range. Now you can add this feather onto any of these points. So if I hold Alt or Option, once again click on my highlights, it's going to add a nice feather from the highlight section down. If I do the same on my underlying layer, I'm going to hold Alt or Option, click on my shadows, and it starts to fade those in a little better. There's not those harsh edges around those different shades of black and dark gray. And I can also do the same once again with my highlights. So holding Alt or Option, clicking and dragging, and it's starting to expose some of those very softly, and it's not as aggressive anymore. So I'm just going to set all these back to 0. Now, since we have a basic understanding of our blend if sliders, the last thing to keep in mind here is our blend if option. We have gray, red, green, and blue. I always just keep mine in gray. The other options here are basically so you can directly affect either your red channel, your green channel, or your blue channel. Now, depending on which option you pick here, the blend if sliders are going to change color. The exact same rules apply. It's now just only affecting either the blue, green, or red channel. Since I just want to stick with my luminance, I'm going to keep mine in the gray for this entire tutorial. So I'm going to click OK, and we're going to go to another image and start to actually put some of this knowledge to use. So in this image here, I just had quickly added a little bit of a light source coming in from the side here. And let's just say I now want to add a little bit more highlights around the edge of this person's shoulder and maybe a little on her face or her hair or something like that. Obviously, the first thing that some people might do is they might just grab an exposure adjustment layer. They might just bump it up a little like this or something, and then they'll just add that on with their layer mask just by painting white onto their black layer mask, and it will just show through some of those bright areas. So that might be someone's first thought when they're wanting to make the highlights a little bit brighter on this person's shoulder. But what if I told you there's a better way to accomplish a similar task with our brush tool and our blend if sliders? So with my brush tool selected, I'm going to sample somewhere in the highlights of her skin just so I get a natural looking tone. So I'm going to sample somewhere up in here and I get kind of this nice peachy tone. And I'm just going to make it a little bit more saturated. So going over to my color picker here, I'm just going to bump this over to make it a little more saturated. Something like this. And now I'm going to paint with a medium size and 0% hardness brush at 100% opacity. I'm just going to paint this on my new layer along the outside of her body, sort of where the highlight would naturally be. I'm not too concerned about going over the edge of her body because I can fix that in just a moment, but I'm just wanting to get the rough position of where I want this highlight to be sitting. So I'm going to put a little more there. And that looks okay for me right there. And now I want to make this blend in a little better. So that is where our blend if sliders are going to come into play. So with this highlight selected, I'll just quickly rename this to highlight. I'm going to double click on that layer and to bring up my layer style dialog box and also my blend if sliders. So sticking in my gray range because I just want to be affecting the luminance here. I'm going to be jumping onto the this layer slider because I want to just blend in the highlight that we just painted into the skin. So what I want to do is fade this out of the dark areas so it is only visible in the bright areas of her skin. So I could just click and drag this bottom slider up a little further like this, but as you'll notice, I'll get to a certain point and suddenly they will just disappear. And that's because they are now outside of our luminance range. So that's why they just randomly disappear like that. So because they just disappear, that means that we have to add a feather to our blend if range. So I just dragged my 2 points together just so that's right near where it starts to disappear. Maybe bring it back a little further. And now I'm going to create that feather. So I'm going to hold Alt or Option, click on that point, and start to drag it out like this. And you'll notice that it starts to really nicely fade into the light parts of her skin, just like that. So with that, I'll click OK, and I'll just turn that on and off, and you can see the very subtle difference that makes. So it adds a little bit more color onto her skin. It doesn't look as washed on her shoulder anymore. It's now taken on that color and it looks really realistic and nice. Now, of course, it did spill a little bit over the edge. So all we have to do to touch that up is grab our quick selection tool. And I'm just going to make a selection around the edge of her body here. And I can just add that onto a layer mask. So now there's no spill onto the outside edges. So turning that on and off, you can see the difference that we made, but now let's go a little bit further and we'll add a couple other tones to make this look even more realistic. So now with this highlight layer, we're going to now add a brighter area, so sort of almost white spot, and then a darker area to accent these lighter areas that we just created. So I'm going to create that new layer, and I'm going to sample another highlight somewhere on our skin, so somewhere around here, nice peach color, and I'm going to go a little whiter. So something like this, and I'm going to go along with a smaller brush size, and I'm just going to paint right along the edge of her body here, making sure not to miss any spots here. Something like that looks fine, and again we'll just apply our layer mask to get rid of those edges that are spilled over. I'll quickly name this to white, and I'm just going to once again access my blend if sliders. So I'm going to double click on my white layer, except this time I'm going to be using my highlights slider to just blend in the highlights rather than the dark areas. Since we are pretty much right near the whites of our luminance range here, if I just drag the whole point down, you'll notice it disappears quite quickly. So I'm just going to be adding a feather to my whites range. So I'm going to hold Alt or Option to add that feather in to my blend if slider. And I'm going to drag this down quite a ways until it starts to have a nice very subtle look on her skin. So that looks pretty good to me right there, and I'm going to click OK. And now since I have already selected that color, I've blended it into the skin, I can just continue to paint that same sort of blend into other similar areas on her body. So I'm going to continue to just paint a little bit more of that highlight around on her shoulder and in here, like so. So now turning that white on and off, you can see the difference that has made. And I'm just going to once again add that same layer mask onto here. So I'm just going to hold Alt or Option to click on this highlight layer mask, drag and drop it onto my whites, and now it has the same layer mask. Just turning these two layers on and off, you can see the quite large difference that it has made to add both a little bit of color and some highlight onto her skin. So that's our whites, and then our highlights has added a little bit of color there. Now the last thing that I'll do is I'll just create one more layer, and I'm going to call this one to darken. And now I'm going to sample somewhere in the shadows of her skin here. So I'm going to sample somewhere in here, kind of a reddy brown color. And now I'll just go through and paint that dark color around the areas that we just highlighted, just so that we add a little bit more contrast onto her skin. So I'm going to go with that for now. And once again, we're going to double click on our darken layer, and we're going to go to our blend if sliders, and we're going to add that feather straight on just by holding Alt or Option, clicking and dragging out on our base point. So I'm going to be adding this feather quite a ways up here, so it's really, really, really soft and almost right meeting with our whites. I'm happy with the look there, so I'm going to click OK. Turning that on and off, you can see how it just darkens that area a little bit more. And if it does feel a little bit too aggressive for you, you can also change your blending mode from normal down here to soft light, and then it will just make that blend in even better. So now you could continue to do these same steps across her cheek, in her hair, things like that. Then that way it would really accent a light source that is coming from this direction, and it can also add some nice color onto the skin. So it doesn't necessarily have to be these natural tones that we picked here. Say you wanted to make it look like this sci-fi looking thing, you could add some blue tones into her skin or some green or whatever you wanted to do. There are tons and tons of options, and that's the really cool part about the blend if sliders. So now just turning these three layers on and off, you can see the very noticeable difference that it does to help highlight and accent the edge of her body. The look and color that we just added onto the edge of her body would not be as easily possible with any other tool in Photoshop other than the blend if sliders. So blending color and exposure into skin tones is a really great way that the blend if tool can be used in your workflow. Now let's move on to our final example. Now the blend if sliders can do a lot besides just blending a single brush stroke into our photo. It can also blend two photos together. So I have this image of a lake here, and let's say I want to add some clouds into my photo. So I have brought a clouds image into Photoshop. I want to blend these clouds into this photo, but I don't want to cut out any of these trees or anything. I just want to naturally blend these clouds into this sky. So what is the tool that we can use for that? I bet you've already guessed it, the blend if sliders. So I'm going to double click on my clouds layer. So the reason that we want to be using our underlying layer option this time around is because we want our underlying layer, which is our dock, to start to show through in these darker areas around the trees, and so that our clouds only remain within the highlights of the sky. So this sounds maybe a little complicated, but it's really easy once we start moving around these blend if sliders. So because I want this to be a relatively hard edge along the edge of our trees here, I'm not going to just create a feather for the entire thing. Otherwise, we're going to have these really faded looking trees, and that's not quite the look that I'm going for. So because I don't want that faded look, but I still want to bring up that base range, what I'm going to do is, rather than adding the feather, I'm going to bring the whole base point up until I'm seeing a good majority of the trees, like so. But then now you notice I'm starting to lose a corner of the sky there. So I'm going to bring this back down till I see the sky. And I'm going to now feather it out. So I've brought up my base, and now I'm going to add that feather in. So I'm going to hold Alt or Option, click on that point to add that feather in. And now you notice that we have created a nice sort of soft edge there. Now, once again, the reason that we use the underlying layer slider this time around rather than the this layer slider is because I didn't want to get rid of the sky that's in our clouds image. I wanted to keep pretty much the entire clouds image in my photo. I just wanted it to not show within these dark areas such as our trees. I wanted to only show in the highlights of our image. If I adjusted the highlights point of the this layer blend if option, you'll notice that my clouds start to disappear, and of course it's definitely not what we want. And if I bring up the dark slider, you'll notice that my clouds start to just look gradually more and more faded until the sky just disappears, and then it has this weird look around it. So I could of course add that feather in, but then I just feel like the clouds become a little bit too faded for my liking. So that's why I'm not adjusting the this layer option for this example. So now turning this layer on and off, you can see that we have completely replaced our sky really simply and easily, and it looks completely realistic. And all we had to do was use our blend diff sliders. We didn't have to do any complicated cutting out layer masks, anything like that. All we did was drag and drop our layers together and use our blend diff sliders to blend our new sky into our lake photo. So it's really as easy as that. Now, when you're using these blend diff sliders, I really encourage you just to experiment with everything, because just like almost anything you do in Photoshop, there is no right or wrong necessarily. It just takes a little bit of practice getting used to and figuring out what works best for you. So that is all I have for you guys for today's tutorial. I hope you learned something about the blend diff sliders, and if you have any more questions regarding them, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you on that. If you enjoyed today's tutorial, make sure to check out last week's tutorial all about a hidden feature to drastically improve the quick selection tool in Photoshop. Now, if you want to see more tutorials just like this one, then make sure to hit that like button, as it really does make a difference, and also consider subscribing to stay up to date on new Photoshop and photo editing tutorials. Of course, if you want to explore more tutorials, make sure to check out bewellcreative.com for tons of other great content. But other than that, guys, that is all I have for you for today. Again, my name is Brendan from bewellcreative.com, and I'll catch you back here next time.